My name is Arthur, and the first time I saw Blackwood Manor, I knew it wasn't like any other house. It wasn't just old. It felt ancient, like it had grown out of the very earth, its stones steeped in centuries of forgotten rain and whispered secrets. My father, a man whose hands were rough from years of honest labor and whose eyes held the quiet weariness of a perpetual optimist, had taken a position as the new groundskeeper for the Fairfax family. It was late autumn, the kind of season where the trees shed their leaves like old memories, and the air carried the crisp scent of decay and wood smoke. We had traveled for days, leaving behind the familiar warmth of our small village for this remote, isolated corner of the countryside, a place where the roads narrowed into winding tracks, and the sky seemed to press down heavier. Blackwood Manor stood on a desolate rise, surrounded by a tangle of gnarled, skeletal trees that seemed to claw at the perpetually gray sky. The manor itself was a sprawling, Gothic monstrosity, built from dark, forbidding stone that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. Its windows, tall and narrow, were like vacant eyes staring out from a skull, and the roof, uneven and jagged, seemed to hunch like a monstrous, watchful beast. A heavy wrought-iron gate, rusted and adorned with intricate thorny patterns, groaned on its hinges as my father pushed it open, a sound that echoed eerily in the stillness. Even the air inside the gate felt different, colder, carrying a faint metallic tang that I couldn't place. My mother, a woman who found beauty in the smallest wildflower and comfort in the simplest prayer, clutched my hand tighter as we walked. Up the long gravel driveway, her usual cheerful chatter had died somewhere back on the main road, replaced by a quiet apprehension. She kept glancing at the manor, her brow furrowed, a silent question in her eyes. I could feel her unease, a cold knot in my own stomach. Even the birds seemed to avoid the place. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots on the gravel and the mournful sigh of the wind through the bare branches. The local villagers, whom we had encountered briefly on our journey, had spoken of the Fairfax family in hushed, almost fearful tones. They were old money, people said, their wealth as deep and dark as the earth itself. But it wasn't just their wealth that inspired such reverence and dread. It was their history, whispers of strange occurrences, of unexplained misfortunes, of generations marked by an unsettling eccentricity, clung to the Fairfax name like the moss on the manor walls. "They keep to themselves," a wizened old woman had told my mother, her eyes wide with unspoken warnings. "Always have. Best not to disturb them." My father, ever practical, had dismissed it as idle gossip, the superstitions of isolated folk. But as I stood before Blackwood Manor, I felt the weight of those whispers, a heavy cloak of foreboding. Our living quarters were in a small stone cottage nestled at the edge of the sprawling grounds, just out of sight of the main house. It was a humble place, but warm, with a small fireplace and a scent of wood smoke that was instantly comforting. My mother set about making it a home, unpacking our few belongings, humming a quiet tune that seemed to chase away some of the chill. My father, after ensuring we were settled, went to report to the Fairfax family. He returned hours later, his face unreadable, a new tightness around his mouth. He said little about his meeting, only that the master, Mr. Elias Fairfax, was a man of few words, and that his instructions were clear. The Fairfax family itself was as unsettling as their ancestral home. Mr. Elias Fairfax was a gaunt, stoic man, his face a roadmap of sharp angles and deep shadows. His eyes, a startling shade of pale gray, seemed to see everything and nothing all at once. And his voice was a low, dry rasp, like leaves skittering across stone. He moved with a quiet, almost spectral grace, appearing and disappearing from rooms without a sound. His wife, Mrs. Isolde Fairfax, was a frail, delicate woman, her skin almost translucent, her eyes perpetually wide with a distant, almost frightened expression. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was a breathy whisper, easily lost. in the vast silence of the manor. They had one child, a daughter named Seraphina, who was a few years older than me. Seraphina was a creature of startling beauty, with long, dark hair and eyes that were too old for her young face. She moved like a shadow, often appearing silently behind you, her presence marked only by a faint, sweet scent of dried roses. She never smiled, and her gaze, when it fell upon you, felt like a cold, knowing touch. My father's duties kept him busy, tending to the overgrown gardens, mending fences, and clearing the tangled paths that snaked through the woods. My mother, with her gentle hands, took on the task of cleaning the manor, a monumental undertaking given the dust and disuse that seemed to cling to every surface. I, being too young for heavy labor, was often left to my own devices, exploring the vast, silent grounds. It was during these explorations that I began to notice the small, unsettling things, the first faint whispers of the manor's macabre history. There was the old well, hidden deep within a forgotten grove of ancient yew trees. Its stone rim was slick with moss, and when I peered into its depths, the darkness seemed to swallow the light, offering no reflection. A cold, damp air rose from it, carrying a faint, earthy smell that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The villagers had warned us about the well, saying it was bottomless and that strange things had been known to happen near it. I never saw anyone draw water from it, and a heavy rusted iron grate covered its mouth, as if to keep something in or out. Then there were the statues. Scattered throughout the overgrown gardens were dozens of stone figures, not the cheerful cherubs or classical nymphs one might expect, but grim, hooded figures, their faces obscured by deep shadows, their hands clasped in what looked like eternal supplication or silent despair. Some were half buried in the earth, others were covered in thick ivy, their silent vigil a constant, unsettling presence. They seemed to watch you as you moved, their unseeing eyes following your every step. One afternoon, while helping my mother dust the vast, echoing library, I stumbled upon a hidden alcove behind a heavy tapestry. Inside, tucked away on a dusty shelf, was a collection of old, leather-bound journals. Their covers were worn and faded, and the pages were filled with elegant looping script that was difficult to decipher. I couldn't read much, but I saw recurring symbols, strange diagrams, and references to the cycles, the harvest, and the ancient pact. My mother, seeing my curiosity, quickly closed the alcove, her face pale. "Some things are best left undisturbed, Arthur," she whispered, her voice tight with a fear I rarely heard from her. "This house holds many old stories. Not all of them are meant for us." But the most unsettling thing was the silence. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was a profound, suffocating quiet that seemed to press down on everything. The manor breathed silence. Even the Fairfaxes themselves moved and spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb something ancient and sleeping. It was a silence that felt heavy with unspoken secrets, a silence that seemed to hum with a hidden energy. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like you were being watched, even when no one was there. As the days turned into weeks, and the last of the autumn leaves fell, I began to feel the manor's influence. The warmth of our cottage felt like a temporary reprieve, a small bubble of normalcy in a world that was becoming increasingly strange. The whispers of the villagers, once dismissed as superstition, now seemed to hold a chilling truth. The Fairfax family and Blackwood Manor were not just eccentric, they were steeped in something ancient and unsettling. And I, a young boy, was now living at the heart of their sinister tale, a tale that was just beginning to unfold. The macabre history of the Fairfax family was not just a story. It was a living, breathing presence that permeated every stone of Blackwood Manor, and I was slowly, irrevocably becoming a part of it. but the snow did little to soften the manor's grim facade. If anything, it made the place feel even more isolated, a forgotten tomb in a frozen world. The silence, once merely unsettling, was now a constant, suffocating presence, muffled further by the heavy drifts outside our cottage window. My mother's cheerful humming had dwindled to a quiet murmur, and my father's face, usually so open and honest, was now a mask of quiet resolve. He worked harder, longer hours, as if sheer exhaustion could fend off the unease that had settled over us all. My own days had become a delicate dance between my mother's duties in the manor and my own explorations. She spent hours inside, dusting, vast, echoing rooms that seemed to hold their secrets in every particle of dust. I would sometimes help, carefully polishing the dark, heavy furniture, my eyes always straying to the closed door of the library, where the hidden alcove and its forbidden journals waited. My curiosity, a restless fire in my stomach, was a powerful force, and I knew it was only a matter of time before I broke my mother's command. The Fairfax family themselves were living ghosts, moving through their own ancestral home as if they didn't belong there. Mr. Elias Fairfax was often in the library, a silent, unmoving sentinel among the books, his pale eyes fixed on some unseen point in the distance. Mrs. Isolde Fairfax was rarely seen at all, confined to her rooms on the upper floors, a faint, distant cough, the only sign of her existence. And then there was Seraphina. She was a constant, unnerving presence, appearing without a sound in the gardens or on the pathways, her dark eyes following my every move. She never spoke to me, but her silence was more potent than any words. It was the silence of a girl who knew a terrible secret and was waiting for you to find it. It was during one of my errands for my father that I met Old Man Finch. He was the previous groundskeeper, a man with a face like a wrinkled apple and a pair of eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 seasons. He was still living in a small, dilapidated cottage on the far side of the grounds, a place even more isolated than our own. My father, in a rare moment of candor, had told me to stay away from him, to not get involved with the old man's stories. But my curiosity, fueled by the manor's suffocating silence, was a far more powerful master than my father's command. I found Old Man Finch, sitting on his porch, a pipe clenched in his gnarled hand, staring out at the frozen landscape. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He just gestured to a small wooden stool beside him, and I sat down, my heart a frantic drumbeat in my chest. He didn't speak for a long time. He just puffed on his pipe, the scent of the sweet tobacco mingling with the cold air, his eyes fixed on the distant looming shape of Blackwood Manor. "They've hired you, then," he said at last, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Your father. He's a good man. Strong hands. He'll need them." I asked him about the manor, about the family, about the whispers from the villagers. He didn't laugh or dismiss my questions. He just listened, his gaze never leaving the manor. "The whispers are true," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And they're only half the story. This place, it has a history, a long, macabre history. The Fairfaxes, they are not like us, boy. They're tied to this land, to this house. It's in their blood, in the very stones." He told me about the cycles, a concept I had seen mentioned in the journals. He spoke of a time when the manor would come alive, when the silence would break, and the air would hum with an unseen energy. He told me about the statues in the garden, saying they weren't just decorations, but guardians, silent sentinels watching over the land. And he spoke of the old well in the yew grove, with a reverence that was both terrifying and profound. "That well is the heart of this place, boy," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "It's where the old blood runs. It's where the pact was made." He didn't elaborate. He just looked at me with a sad, knowing intensity that chilled me to the bone. That night, my curiosity, a constant low-level ache, finally overwhelmed my fear. After my parents had gone to bed, I crept back into the manor, a small, lit candle. In my hand, its flame a trembling speck in the vast, echoing darkness. I found the library, the heavy door groaning as I pushed it open. I found the tapestry, pulled it aside, and reached for one of the old leather-bound journals. Its cover was cold and stiff beneath my fingers, its pages brittle with age. I opened it to a random page, the elegant looping script a beautiful, indecipherable mystery. But on one page, a single entry stood out. A short, simple paragraph that I could understand. The new cycle begins. The harvest is ready. The price must be paid. The words were like a physical blow. They made no sense, and yet they made all the sense in the world. I thought of Old Man Finch's words, of the pact and the old blood. I thought of the statues, of the well, and of the profound, suffocating silence of the manor. And I thought of Seraphina, her silent, knowing gaze, and the faint, sweet scent of dried roses that clung to her. A cold, terrible understanding began to dawn on me. The history of the Fairfax family was not just a story. It was a living, breathing thing. It was a cycle, a rhythm of existence that was tied to this house, to this land, to this well. I heard a sound then, a quiet footfall from the hallway. I quickly closed the book, snuffed out the candle, and crept into the shadows behind a towering bookcase. I held my breath, my heart a frantic drumbeat in my chest. The footsteps stopped just outside the library. I could feel a presence, a watchful, patient energy on the other side of the door. Then, with a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, I heard my name. Arthur. It was Seraphina. Her voice, a delicate, breathy sound, was full of a cold, terrible knowing. She knew I was there. She knew I had been reading the journals. And she knew that I had just stumbled upon the first, terrible secret of Blackwood Manor. The macabre. History of the Fairfax family was no longer just a story. It was a physical presence, and it had just found me. My childhood, a life of simple truths, was now a thing of the past. I was a part of the manor's sinister tale now, and I was about to find out exactly what the price was. It wasn't the voice of a girl who had caught me doing something wrong. It was the voice of a creature who had been watching me, who had been waiting for this moment. I stayed hidden behind the towering bookcase, my heart a frantic drumbeat in my chest, the cold, brittle pages of the journal pressed against my hand. The silence stretched on, a suffocating blanket of tension that seemed to hum with an unseen energy. "You should not have read that, Arthur," she said at last. Her voice, a low, breathy whisper that seemed to come from all around me. "Some things are not meant to be known." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I held my breath, a small, trembling child, in a vast, menacing silence. I could hear the faint, soft rustle of her dress, the quiet footfalls as she moved away. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my body stiff with terror, before I finally dared to creep out from behind the bookcase. The library was empty. The door was still open. The only sign that she had been there was a faint, lingering scent of dried roses, a scent that now felt less like a perfume and more like the perfume of a graveyard. I crept back to our cottage, the forbidden journal still clutched in my hand, its words a searing brand in my mind. The new cycle begins. The harvest is ready. The price must be paid. The words made no sense. And yet, in the grim context of Blackwood Manor, they made all the sense in the world. I thought of Old Man Finch's words, of the pact and the old blood, and a terrible, chilling clarity began to form. The history of the Fairfax family was not just a story, It was a cycle, a rhythm of existence that was tied to this house, to this land, to this well, and a new cycle, it seemed, was beginning. The next day, a change came over the manor, a subtle but profound shift in its atmosphere. The suffocating silence, a constant low-level dread, was replaced by a humming, restless energy. The Fairfaxes themselves seemed to come alive. Mr. Elias Fairfax, who had been a silent, unmoving sentinel in the library, now moved with a purpose, his pale eyes alight with an unsettling zeal. Mrs. Isolde Fairfax, who had been a frail, distant presence, now appeared in the gardens, a frail, delicate ghost in a world of stark, skeletal trees. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her hands moving through the air as if she were sculpting something from the cold, frozen light. And Seraphina, her silent, watchful presence, now felt less like a threat and more like a guard, a sentinel, watching over a sacred, terrible ritual that was about to begin. My father, ever the practical man, noticed the change as well. He spoke of it with a kind of weary resignation. "The family is preparing for something," he said one evening, his eyes fixed on the distant, looming shape of the manor. "A ceremony, perhaps, something old. They are a family of strange customs." My mother, her face a mask of quiet fear, said nothing, but her eyes, as they met mine, held a silent, knowing plea. She knew I had a secret. She knew I had a burden. It was during one of my errands to the far side of the grounds that I finally sought out Old Man Finch. The weight of my secret and the chilling words of the journal were a burden I could no longer carry alone. I found him in his small, dilapidated cottage, the air thick with the scent of tobacco and old wood. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He just gestured to a small wooden stool beside him, and I sat down, my heart a frantic drumbeat in my chest. "You've been in the library, haven't you, boy?" he said at last, his eyes fixed on me with a knowing intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "You've read the journals. You know about the cycles." I nodded, unable to speak. The truth was out. The secret was shared. "The Fairfaxes have always been a family of deep, dark secrets," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "They came to this land centuries ago with a pact with the earth, with this place. They are not just landowners, boy, they are keepers, guardians. And the price is a terrible one." He told me a story then, a story that was so chilling and so bizarre that it sounded less like history and more like a fever dream. He spoke of a time a generation ago when the manor was a place of vibrant, unsettling life. He spoke of a young, beautiful Fairfax woman, the last of her line, who had come to the manor with a secret illness, a sickness that no doctor could cure. He spoke of the family's frantic, desperate search for a cure, a search that led them to the old journals, to the cycles, and to the well. He spoke of a ritual, a terrible unspoken act that had taken place in the dead of night, in the yew grove, by the old, bottomless well. He didn't say what the ritual was. He didn't have to. The look on his face, the quiet, profound horror in his eyes, told me everything I needed to know. He said that the ritual had worked. The woman had been cured. She had gone on to live a long life, to have children, to continue the Fairfax line. But the price had been paid. The harvest had been taken. "The pact requires a balance, boy," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "A life for a life. A soul for a soul. The land. It demands a sacrifice. And the Fairfaxes, they always pay the price." His words were like a physical blow. I thought of the statues, of their grim, sorrowful faces. I thought of the silence, a profound and suffocating silence that was suddenly filled with the ghostly whispers of the past. I thought of Seraphina, her silent, knowing gaze. and the faint, sweet scent of dried roses that clung to her. And I thought of the well, the old bottomless well in the yew grove, and the cold, earthy smell that rose from its depths. That night, my world, a world of simple truths and simple lies, was shattered. The history of the Fairfax family was not just a macabre story. It was a living, breathing horror. It was a cycle of life and death, a terrible, unending rhythm that was tied to this house, to this land, to this well. And I, a young boy with a terrible secret and a profound, unshakable fear, was now living at the heart of their sinister tale. The new cycle had begun, and I was about to find out in the most terrifying way possible what the harvest was. My childhood, a life of simple truths, was now a thing of the past. I was a part of the manor's macabre history now, and the price, it seemed, was about to be paid. After hearing Old Man Finch's terrible story, my world, which had already been teetering on the edge of sanity, finally fell into the abyss. The grim statues in the garden were no longer just morbid decorations. They were silent witnesses to a long line of sacrifices. The suffocating silence of Blackwood Manor was not just the absence of noise, it was the heavy, pregnant silence before a terrible storm. And the old well in the yew grove was not just a bottomless pit, it was the heart of the manor's sinister pact, a place where a debt was paid. I was a child with a profound and horrifying knowledge, and I was now trapped inside the very history I had been so curious to uncover. The change I had noticed in the manor's atmosphere now intensified into a palpable, humming energy. It felt like the very air was charged, a low, constant vibration that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The Fairfaxes were no longer living ghosts. They were creatures of purpose, moving with a cold, unsettling focus. Mr. Elias Fairfax, his pale eyes burning with an almost feverish intensity, spent his days in the garden, not tending to plants, but meticulously arranging the grim stone statues, moving them into what looked like a strange, ceremonial pattern. Mrs. Isolde Fairfax, once a frail, distant presence, was now a constant spectral figure in the manor's halls, her translucent hands tracing the intricate, thorny patterns on the walls, her lips moving in a silent, continuous prayer. And Seraphina, her silent, watchful presence, now felt less like a guard and more like a high priestess, a willing participant in a sacred, terrible ritual that was about to reach its terrifying climax. One afternoon, I crept into the shadows of the garden, my heart a frantic drumbeat in my chest. I had to know. I had to see. I found Mr. Elias Fairfax standing in the center of the strange, new pattern he had created with the statues. He was holding a small silver dagger in his hand, its blade glinting in the pale, cold light. He didn't use the dagger to cut a plant or a branch. He used it to cut his own hand, a quick, precise slice across his palm. A few drops of dark crimson blood fell onto the frozen earth, and as the drops hit the ground, the humming energy in the air intensified, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to fill the entire valley. The grim statues, I swear, seemed to hum in response, a chorus of silent, watchful guardians. The act was not one of pain, but of reverence. It was a sacrament, a communion, a ritual that had been passed down through generations. I understood then that the old blood, as Old Man Finch had called it, was not just a metaphor. It was a literal, physical part of the pact. The Fairfaxes were feeding the land, paying their tribute, preparing for the harvest. But what was the harvest? My mind, a frantic, terrified mess of images and stories, replayed the chilling words from the journal. The price must be paid. I thought of the old woman, of the sick young woman in Old Man Finch's story, and of the cure that had been bought with a terrible price. A cold, dreadful realization began to dawn on me. The harvest was not a plant or a crop. The harvest was a life, a soul, the life of a newcomer, A fresh soul to pay the price, my own family. The thought was a physical blow. We were the new arrivals. We were the fresh blood in a land that was ravenous for a new life. My father with his honest hands. My mother with her gentle heart. My terror, which had been a private, internal thing, now had a terrifying external face. I ran. I ran back to our cottage, my heart a frantic drumbeat in my chest, the cold, dark silence of the manor's grounds a living, breathing predator at my heels. I had to warn them. I had to tell them the truth, the terrible, unforgivable truth that I had stumbled upon in the shadows of the manor. I burst into our cottage, panting, my words a desperate, incoherent jumble of fear and warnings. But my parents, kind, simple people that they were, did not understand. They saw a frightened, exhausted child, a child whose imagination had run, wild in a house of strange customs and old secrets. "It's just an old family tradition, Arthur," my father said, his voice weary but firm. "They're a strange people, but they're not monsters." But they were. I knew it. The proof was not in their words, but in their actions. I thought of the statues, of the blood, of the humming energy that permeated every stone of the manor. I knew they were monsters, and they were about to take my family. And then I saw her, Serafina. She was standing outside our cottage window, a silent, spectral figure in the falling snow. Her dark eyes, too old for her young face, met mine. She didn't look at me with a threat, but with a kind of terrible pity. "The cycle has begun, Arthur," she said, her voice a low, breathy whisper that seemed to come from the very air itself. "The harvest is ready. The price will be paid." Her words, a cold, terrible echo of the journal, were a final, chilling confirmation. The macabre history of the Fairfax family was not just a story. It was a living, breathing horror, and my family, my simple, kind family, was about to become the next chapter. My childhood was a thing of the past. My life was now a race against time, a desperate, impossible battle against a family whose soul and whose history was tied to the very earth of Blackwood Manor. The price, it seemed, was about to be paid, and I was about to find out in the most terrifying way possible what the harvest was. When Serafina's words echoed through the cold, still air, it was like a final fatal blow to the last vestiges of my childhood. Her face, a silent, spectral figure in the falling snow, held a look of chilling pity. She wasn't a threat. She was a harbinger. The cycle had begun. The harvest was my family. The cold dread that had been a constant companion since our arrival at Blackwood Manor now turned into a burning, desperate need for action. I burst back into our cottage, my heart a frantic drumbeat in my chest. My parents were sitting by the fireplace, the warm, flickering light casting dancing shadows on their faces, a beautiful, fragile portrait of normalcy. I looked at them, at my father's kind, honest eyes, and my mother's gentle, weary face, and the words came out in a desperate, incoherent jumble of fear and warnings. I told them everything. I told them about the journals, about Old Man Finch, about the cycles and the pact. I told them about Serafina's words, and I told them that we had to leave. We had to leave now. But they didn't understand. They looked at me with a kind of gentle, bewildered pity, the same look a parent gives a child who has just woken from a bad dream. They saw a frightened, exhausted boy, not a messenger of a terrible, unforgivable truth. "It's just an old family tradition, Arthur," my father said, his voice a low, weary rumble. "They're a strange people, but they're not monsters." My mother, her hand on my brow, told me to go to bed, to rest, to let the nightmares pass. They were kind, simple people, and their kindness was a wall I couldn't break. But I knew the truth. The humming energy that had permeated the manor's grounds was no longer a vague feeling. It was a living, breathing presence that now seemed to press down on our cottage. The fire in the hearth, a small, defiant flame in a world of profound darkness, began to flicker and die, its warmth sucked out of the room by an unseen force. The wind, which had been a soft, mournful sigh, now rose into a sharp, mournful howl, rattling the windows and groaning at the doors. The house, which had been our sanctuary, was now a trap. My desperation, a powerful and terrible force, finally gave way to a singular, terrifying idea. They would not believe my words, but they would believe their own eyes. The well. Old man. Finch's words echoed in my mind, a cold, gravelly whisper from a forgotten past. That well is the heart of this place, boy. It's where the old blood runs. It's where the pact was made. The truth, I realized, was not in the journals, but in the earth itself. I had to show them. I had to take them to the well. I grabbed my father's hand, my own small hand, a trembling, urgent force. I pulled him from his chair, my words a desperate, incoherent stream. "The well," I said. "The well. We have to go to the well." My father, startled by my sudden ferocity, looked at me with a mixture of confusion and concern. My mother, her face a mask of worry, tried to soothe me, to calm me, to pull me back to the warmth of the fireplace. But I was beyond their reach. I was a child on a mission, a child whose innocence had been stolen by a terrible, unforgivable truth. I ran out into the cold, dark night, my small body a beacon of terrified purpose in a world of profound darkness. My parents, their fear and concern, now a desperate living thing, followed me. The wind howled around us, a cold, mournful sound that seemed to carry the ghostly whispers of the past. The skeletal trees seemed to reach out with their gnarled, bony fingers, their shadows dancing and twisting in the pale, cold moonlight, a silent, menacing chorus of ancient watchers. The grim statues in the garden, which had been so silent and still, now seemed to hum with a low, resonant energy, their unseeing eyes a constant, watchful presence in the darkness. We were running, but it felt like we were running in place, like we were caught in a terrible, living nightmare. We finally reached the old well, a grim, moss-covered monument to a secret that had been buried for centuries. The air around it was cold and heavy, carrying a faint, earthy smell that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I looked at my parents, their faces a mask of confusion and fear in the pale moonlight. "Look," I said, my voice a small, trembling whisper. "Just look." I grabbed the heavy, rusted iron grate that covered the well's mouth, and, with a strength born of pure, unadulterated terror, I pulled it open. The sound of the rusted metal groaning on its hinges was a terrible, mournful shriek that echoed in the stillness of the night. I peered into the darkness, my heart a frantic drumbeat in my chest. There was no reflection, only a profound, suffocating darkness that seemed to swallow the light. But from that darkness, from the bottomless depths of the well, a sound rose. It wasn't a growl or a moan or a whisper. It was a chorus of sounds, a cacophony of 100,000 voices, a symphony of 1,000 years of screams, of 1,000 years of pain, of 1,000 years of a debt that had been paid. The sound was a terrible, mournful shriek that seemed to come from the very earth itself, a sound that was so filled with agony and so full of despair that it shattered the very air around us. My parents, their faces a mask of horror and disbelief, finally understood. Their kindness, their skepticism, their simple, ordinary lives were no match for the profound and ancient evil that had been living at the heart of Blackwood Manor for centuries. The macabre history of the Fairfax family was not just a story. It was a living, breathing, screaming presence, and we were trapped inside it. We had made it to the well, but we were not safe. We were at the heart of the nightmare, and we were about to find out, in the most terrifying way possible, what the price was. When the chorus of 100,000 voices screamed from the bottomless depths of the well, the illusion of our simple lives shattered into a million pieces. My parents, who had seen me as a child with an overactive imagination, now saw the truth in a profound, terrifying way. My mother's scream was a sharp, heart-wrenching sound that was swallowed by the larger scream from the well. My father's face, a mask of disbelief and horror, finally understood the price of the Fairfax family's history. He grabbed my mother, and me, his hands trembling with a fear that was more primal and more powerful than any I had ever seen. "Run," he said, his voice a low, guttural roar that was lost in the cacophony of the well's ghostly chorus. "We have to run. Now." The run back from the well was not a simple flight to safety. It was a desperate, terrifying race against the very land itself. The silence that had once defined Blackwood Manor was now gone, replaced by a symphony of supernatural dread. The wind, a cold, mournful howl, tore at our clothes, seeming to push us back to hold us captive. The grim stone statues in the garden, their unseeing eyes a constant, watchful presence, seemed to shift in the pale moonlight, their shadows stretching and twisting like ghostly, malevolent limbs. It felt as though the entire estate had come, alive, and every stone, every tree, and every gust of wind was a part of the manor's sinister pact. We were running toward the wrought iron gate, a beacon of hope in a world of profound darkness. But the gate, which had groaned open so easily on the day we arrived, was now closed, its heavy rusted hinges locked with a chain that seemed to appear from nowhere. My father, with the desperate strength of a man fighting for his family, threw his shoulder against the iron bars. But it was useless. The gate was an unbreakable wall, a final, terrible barrier that was keeping us in. And then we saw her, Serafina. She was standing in the center of the driveway, a silent, spectral figure, in a long white dress. She was not running. She was not a threat. She was a sentinel, a guardian, a creature of purpose whose dark eyes held a kind of terrible, profound pity. She was not an enemy. She was a warden. She knew we were trying to escape, and she knew it was futile. The harvest, a terrible and brutal debt, was about to be paid, and she was there to watch it happen. My father, his face a mask of grief and despair, saw her too. The realization hit him with a terrible, chilling force. The Fairfax family was not just a family of strange customs. They were a part of the land itself. They were a part of the pact, a terrible, unending cycle of life and death that had been going on for centuries. He grabbed our hands, his grip a tight, desperate force, and we turned, running away from the gate and back toward the manor, toward a different path, a new hope. We ran into the woods, the trees, and the undergrowth, a confusing, tangled maze of profound darkness. But the woods were no sanctuary. The path, which had been so clear on my mother's map, now seemed to twist and turn, the familiar landmarks disappearing, replaced by an endless, monotonous wall of silent, skeletal trees. It was a new kind of prison, a living, breathing one, a prison of shadows and lies. And then, in a small clearing, we found him. Old Man Finch. He was sitting on a fallen log, his face a mask of quiet resignation, his eyes fixed on the distant, looming shape of Blackwood Manor. He didn't seem surprised to see us. He just gestured to the log beside him, and we sat down, our bodies trembling with a fear that was so profound it had become a physical thing. "You heard the chorus, didn't you, boy?" he said at last, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You heard the screams. They're all down there. The old blood, the new blood, the price that was paid." His words were not a warning, but a simple, terrible statement of fact. My father, his voice a low, desperate plea, asked him to help us, to tell us how to escape. Old Man Finch just shook his head, his face a map of quiet, profound sorrow. "There's no escaping, boy," he said. The land, it doesn't let you go. The pact is old. It's in the very stones of this place, the Fairfaxes. They are just the keepers, the guardians, the ones who pay the price. He looked at my mother and me, his eyes filled with a kind of quiet, desperate pity. But the pact has a weakness, he said, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. The blood, it needs a clean slate, a fresh offering, a new soul to pay the price. The harvest, it only takes one. It only takes the one who is tied to the land, the one who has seen the truth. His words, a chilling, terrible echo of the journal, were a final, brutal truth. The harvest was not just any soul. The harvest was the one who knew the secret, the one who had seen the truth, who had heard the screams, who had touched the history. My mind, a frantic, terrified mess of images and stories, replayed the words. The one who has seen the truth. I was the one. My father, my mother, they had seen it too. We had all seen it. We were all the harvest. The pact demanded a new, pure soul to replace the old ones, a new soul to feed the land. And we, a family of honest, simple people, were the new souls. We were the price. My mother, her face a mask of profound, unshakable love, put her arms around me, her body a small, defiant shield against the terrible ancient evil that was waiting for us. The macabre history of the Fairfax family was no longer just a story. It was a living, breathing horror, and we, a family of honest, simple people, were about to become its final, terrifying chapter. My childhood was a thing of the past. My life was now a terrible, impossible battle against a family whose soul and whose history was tied to the very earth of Blackwood Manor. The price, it seemed, was about to be paid, and I was about to find out, in the most terrifying way possible, what the harvest was. When Old Man Finch spoke of the harvest, a cold, terrible understanding settled over me. It wasn't a random act of malevolence, it was a ritual, a profound ancient debt that had to be paid. The Fairfax family weren't just murderers. They were the guardians of a pact, the keepers of a terrible, unending cycle. We, a family of honest, simple people, were the new souls, the fresh offerings, the price that the land demanded. My mother, her face a mask of profound, unshakable love, held me close, her body a small, defiant shield against the ancient evil that was waiting for us. My father, his grief and despair now replaced by a fierce, protective rage, stood ready, his hands clenched into fists, a man who would die fighting for his family. Old Man Finch, a creature of quiet resignation, just watched. His eyes filled with a kind of terrible, profound sorrow. "There's no running, boy," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The land has a hunger, and it has chosen its meal." And then, in the pale, cold moonlight, we saw them, the Fairfax family. They were not running. They were not chasing us. They were walking. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, a procession of shadows moving through the skeletal trees. Mr. Elias Fairfax, a gaunt, stoic figure, was in the lead, his pale eyes burning with an almost feverish intensity. Mrs. Isolde Fairfax, a frail, delicate ghost, was beside him, her translucent hands clasped in a silent prayer. And Seraphina, her dark, knowing eyes fixed on me, was behind them, a silent, watchful presence whose silence was more potent than any words. They were not a family of people. They were a family of purpose, a family who had come to collect on a debt. "The time has come, Arthur," Mr. Elias Fairfax said, his voice a low, dry rasp that seemed to come from the very air itself. He stood before us, a sentinel of a terrible, ancient tradition, his face a map of sharp angles and deep shadows. "The land has a hunger. It is old. It is insatiable, and it must be fed. My father, his voice a low, defiant roar, stepped forward. "We are not your harvest," he said. "We are not your sacrifice. We will not pay your price." Mr. Elias Fairfax just smiled, a thin, chilling line that did not reach his eyes. "You have already paid, my friend," he said. "The moment you saw the truth, you became a part of the pact. The moment you heard the screams from the well, you became its harvest. The land, it knows, and it hungers." He spoke of the pact then, a terrible, chilling story that was so steeped in centuries of darkness that it sounded less like history and more like a fever dream. He spoke of his ancestors, of a time when the land was barren, the family was dying, and a desperate, unforgivable choice was made. He spoke of the pact with the earth, a terrible, unending rhythm of life and death, of a debt that had to be paid with the blood of newcomers, with the souls of the living. He spoke of the statues, of the guardians, of the well, the old, bottomless. Well, that was the heart of the pact. "The well is not a well, boy," he said, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. "It is a mouth, and it is waiting for its meal." Seraphina, her silent, watchful presence a constant, unnerving force, then stepped forward. She looked at me, her dark, knowing eyes filled with a kind of terrible, profound pity. "You could have been one of us, Arthur," she said, her voice a low, breathy whisper that seemed to come from the very air itself. "You have the sight, the curiosity, the blood. It would have accepted you." Her words were not a threat. They were a different kind of horror, a temptation of a terrible, unforgivable power. She was offering me a way out, a way to save myself, but at the cost of my family, at the cost of my soul. I looked at her pale, beautiful face, and I saw not a girl, but a monster, a willing participant in a ritual that had been going on for centuries. My father, his grief and despair now replaced by a fierce, protective rage, pulled me back. "We are not your harvest," he said, his voice a low, defiant roar. "We will not pay your price." He stood before us, a man who had been a groundskeeper, a man of simple truths, a man who was now fighting a battle against an ancient, terrible evil. My mother, her face a mask of profound, unshakable love, stood beside him, her hand in his, a small, defiant shield against the profound darkness that surrounded us. Mr. Elias Fairfax, his smile a thin, chilling line, just shook his head. "The choice, my friend, was not yours to make," he said. "The land, it has already chosen. The harvest is ready." He gestured toward the old, bottomless well in the yew grove, a grim, moss-covered monument to a secret that had been buried for centuries. The humming energy, a low, resonant thrum that had been a constant presence since our arrival, now intensified into a powerful, palpable force that seemed to pull at our very souls, a force that was pulling us toward the well, toward a final, terrible destiny. We were at the heart of the nightmare, a small, defiant family against an ancient, terrible evil. The macabre history of the Fairfax family was no longer just a story. It was a living, breathing horror, and we, a family of honest, simple people, were about to become its final, terrifying chapter. The price, it seemed, was about to be paid, and I was about to find out, in the most terrifying way possible, what the harvest was. My childhood was a thing of the past. My life was now a terrible, impossible battle against a family whose soul and whose history was tied to the very earth of Blackwood Manor. When Mr. Elias Fairfax spoke of the land's hunger, I knew we were at the heart of the nightmare. The air was thick with a humming, resonant energy, a low thrum that seemed to pull at our very souls. The Fairfax family, a silent, spectral procession, began to move, their purpose as cold and unyielding as the stones of the manor itself. They were leading us to the well, the old, bottomless well that was the heart of their sinister pact. My father, his grief and despair now replaced by a fierce protective rage, stood ready, his hands clenched into fists, a man who would die fighting for his family. My mother, her face a mask of profound, unshakable love, stood beside him, her hand in his, a small, defiant shield against the profound darkness that surrounded us. Old Man Finch, a creature of quiet resignation, just watched, his eyes filled with a kind of terrible, profound sorrow. "There's no running, boy," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "The land has a hunger, and it has chosen its meal." The walk to the well was a silent, terrifying procession. The wind, a cold, mournful howl, tore at our clothes, seeming to push us back, to hold us captive. The grim stone statues in the garden, their unseeing eyes a constant, watchful presence, seemed to hum in response to the family's approach, a chorus of silent, malevolent guardians. It felt as though the entire estate had come alive, and every stone, every tree, and every gust of wind was a part of the manor's sinister pact. We arrived at the yew grove, a circle of ancient, skeletal trees that seemed to claw at the perpetually gray sky. In the center, a grim, moss-covered monument to a secret that had been buried for centuries was the old, bottomless well. A cold, damp air rose from it, carrying a faint, earthy smell that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The humming, energy, a constant, low thrum that had been a constant presence since our arrival, now intensified into a powerful, palpable force that seemed to pull at our very souls. Mr. Elias Fairfax, his face a map of sharp angles and deep shadows, stood at the well's edge, a sentinel of a terrible, ancient tradition, his pale eyes burning with an almost feverish intensity. Mrs. Isolde Fairfax, a frail, delicate ghost, stood beside him, her translucent hands clasped in a silent prayer. And Seraphina, her dark, knowing eyes fixed on me, was behind them, a silent, watchful presence whose silence was more potent than any words. They were not a family of people. They were a family of purpose, a family who had come to collect on a debt. "The price must be paid," Mr. Elias Fairfax said, his voice a low, dry rasp that seemed to come from the very air itself. He gestured toward the well, a final, chilling invitation to a terrible, unforgivable end. "The land. It waits for its meal." My father, his grief and despair now replaced by a fierce, protective rage, pulled my mother and me behind him, his hands clenched into fists, a man who would die fighting for his family. But his courage was no match for the profound, ancient evil that was waiting for us. The humming energy, a powerful, palpable force, began to pull at our bodies, a terrible, unseen force that was dragging us toward the well. And then, in the midst of this profound darkness, a voice, a low, gravelly rasp from the shadows of the yew grove, broke the silence. "The pact has a loophole," Old Man Finch said, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. "The land, it only hungers for the fresh, for the new. It does not want the old." Mr. Elias Fairfax turned to him, his face a mask of cold fury. "You have broken the pact," he said. "You have revealed the secret. You will pay the price." But Old Man Finch just smiled, a thin, chilling line that did not reach his eyes. "I have already paid, my friend," he said. "I have lived my life. The land, it has had its fill of me." He then, with a quiet, solemn grace, stepped forward, his body a small, defiant shield against the profound darkness that was pulling at us all. He looked at us, at my mother and father and me, with a look of profound love and a kind of terrible, profound sorrow. "Go," he said, his voice a low, urgent murmur. "Run, and never ever come back." and with that, he threw himself into the well. The sound was a terrible, mournful shriek that seemed to come from the very earth itself, a sound that was so filled with agony and so full of despair that it shattered the very air around us. The humming energy, a powerful, palpable force, suddenly ceased. The silence, a profound and suffocating silence that was so different from the silence we had come to know, returned. The Fairfax family, a silent spectral procession, turned to face the well. They did not look at us. They did not look at old man Finch. They looked at the well, and in their eyes I saw not joy or triumph, but a terrible, profound sorrow. The price had been paid. The harvest had been taken. My father, his grief and despair now replaced by a fierce, protective rage, grabbed my mother and me, his hands trembling with a fear that was so profound it had become a physical thing. He pulled us away from the well, away from the Fairfax family, away from a terrible, ancient evil that had been living at the heart of Blackwood Manor for centuries. We ran, a small, terrified family in a world of profound darkness. Our hearts a frantic drumbeat in our chests, our lives a desperate, impossible battle against a family whose soul and whose history was tied to the very earth of Blackwood Manor. We escaped. We made it to the wrought iron gate, and this time it opened. The gate groaned open on its hinges, a silent, mournful shriek that was swallowed by the silence of the night. We ran, a small, terrified family, out into the world, a world that was so much bigger than our small, terrible valley. We were survivors, witnesses, and a voice for the voiceless. The macabre history of the Fairfax family was no longer just a story. It was a living, breathing horror, and we, a family of honest, simple people, were its final, terrifying chapter. Our childhood was a thing of the past. Our lives were now a story of a boy who had escaped the darkness to find the light, a story of hope, a story of truth, and a story of a community that was finally, after centuries of silence, free.